David Morrison, a 47-year-old farmer, discovered that his family's land had been sold by the Homeowners Association without his permission. The sale was completed under the direction of HOA President Victoria Sterling, who claimed the land was abandoned due to David's failure to maintain the property. Despite the land being in active use for 3 generations, including the farms, crops, and livestock, the HOA disregarded David's ownership. The reason given for the sale was a minor issue: a neglected chicken coop, which David had been unable to maintain due to his heavy workload. Victoria, who had long disapproved of David's farm life, used her position to push the sale through, citing trivial complaints as justification. David found himself blindsided by the decision, with no prior notice or approval from him. The farm, the livelihood his family had built, was gone. Victoria had long been an antagonist, constantly undermining David and his work. This, however, crossed a line. Her actions left David facing the loss of everything he had worked for, without a chance to contest it. Determined to regain what was taken from him, David resolved to take action. David knew that regaining his farm would require a clear strategy. His immediate course of action was to gather all necessary documentation proving his ownership of the property. The first step was to collect the land deed, which outlined his legal ownership. He also retrieved tax records to show his consistent payments over the years. These documents would serve as the foundation for any legal challenge. The HOA's claim of abandonment was unfounded. The farm had been in active use for generations, and there was no legal basis for such an accusation. Next, David contacted the county office to verify the sale details. He requested copies of all documents related to the transfer of the property, specifically any correspondence or signatures that would indicate the sale was valid. He suspected that Victoria had used her position to push through the sale, bypassing legal procedures and potentially forging documents. He also requested any records showing the HOA's involvement in the transaction, particularly those related to her approval of the sale. While he waited for the documents, David began researching the HOA's governing rules and regulations. He meticulously studied the clauses related to property sales and the powers vested in the HOA president. It became evident that Victoria had exceeded her authority. The HOA's charter outlined procedures for handling property disputes, but nowhere did it grant the president the unilateral power to sell off land without the consent of the property owner. David also looked into the broader legal framework governing property rights in his state. He consulted online legal resources and reviewed cases similar to his situation, where homeowners had fought against improper land sales and HOA overreach. He noted the importance of proving that the sale was both unauthorized and based on false pretenses. He began to build a case that not only highlighted the fraudulence of the sale, but also demonstrated the wrongful actions of the HOA president. While preparing his legal approach, David reached out to a local attorney who specialized in property law. He explained his situation and sent over the documents he had gathered so far. The attorney, after reviewing the materials, confirmed that the sale was highly questionable and that there was a strong case for challenging it. He suggested filing a lawsuit against the HOA for breach of contract, fraud, and a violation of property rights. However, David knew that taking legal action would take time, and he needed a quicker way to apply pressure on the HOA and Victoria. With this in mind, David began to focus on the community's involvement. He was aware that the HOA's influence extended beyond his property, affecting the lives of many residents. He contacted a few neighbors who had been critical of Victoria's leadership and explained his situation. Some of them were already aware of her tactics, having witnessed her attempts to control the neighborhood through intimidation and manipulation. David recognized that exposing Victoria's actions to the wider community would not only strengthen his case, but also garner support for his cause. David's plan was to gather enough support to challenge the legitimacy of Victoria's position and the HOA's decisions. He drafted a petition that would allow homeowners to express their dissatisfaction with the HOA's leadership. The petition highlighted Victoria's conflict of interest, her overreach in selling David's land without consent, and the lack of transparency in her dealings. He sent the petition out to several neighbors, including those who had experienced similar problems. With the HOA in the past, within days, signatures began to pile up. David didn't just stop at petitions. He began organizing a series of informal meetings with fellow residents to discuss their grievances with the HOA. He strategically timed these meetings to ensure that key individuals, particularly those who had suffered under Victoria's administration, would attend. These residents shared stories of how their properties had been mishandled or how their concerns had been ignored by the HOA leadership. Many were also fed up with the way Victoria had used her position for personal gain, and they saw an opportunity to finally hold her accountable. In addition to building community support, David continued to gather more evidence. He obtained further details about the land sale, including the sale price and the identity of the buyer. The buyer turned out to be a company that had close ties to Victoria. This connection further fueled David's suspicion that the sale had been orchestrated for personal profit rather than out of any legitimate concern for the neighborhood. As the evidence against Victoria mounted, David became more certain that he could not let her actions go unchallenged. His next step was to contact the local news outlets. With the help of his attorney, he arranged for a press conference to publicly announce his intention to expose Victoria's misconduct and fight for the return of his property. David understood the importance of media attention and rallying public support and pressuring the HOA into taking corrective action. When the day of the press conference arrived, David stood before the cameras, ready to make his case. He presented the evidence he had gathered, showing how Victoria had manipulated the system to steal his property and enrich herself. He explained how the sale was invalid and how the HOA had failed in its duty to protect the interests of the community. The press conference attracted significant attention, and soon, local news outlets were covering the story. The combination of legal action, public exposure, and community pressure forced the HOA to reconsider its position. As the story gained momentum, Victoria's grip on the neighborhood began to weaken. The board members of the HOA, many of whom had been either unaware or complicit in her actions, found themselves in a difficult position. The pressure from both the community and the media was mounting, and they knew that ignoring David's claims any longer would only harm their reputation further. David's initial steps had proven effective. He had not only built a solid legal case but had also turned the community against Victoria and her questionable leadership. The next phase of his strategy would involve formal legal action. But for now, he had already succeeded in making Victoria's position untenable. She could no longer rely on her position of power to silence dissent. The fight for his land had only just begun. But David was confident that he was on the right path. David understood that the HOA would not correct the wrongful sale of his property, nor would they take responsibility for the actions of their president, Victoria Sterling. Therefore, he knew he had to pursue the matter independently. Drawing from his background in financial crime investigation, David set out to gather evidence that would expose Victoria's misconduct and put his land back into his hands. His first step was to systematically review all HOA records related to his land. David knew that there would be traces of the sale somewhere within the documents. He focused on identifying any discrepancies, starting with the property transfer papers. He ordered copies from the county recorder's office and cross-checked them with the land deeds in his possession. The signatures on these papers were particularly important. He suspected that Victoria had used her position to forge his consent to the sale. As David analyzed the documents, he found inconsistencies in the signatures and dates that raised immediate red flags. He also obtained tax records for the past few years. Focusing on his farm's history with the HOA, These documents helped David prove that his property had been maintained properly and had not been abandoned. It became clear that the HOA's claim that David had abandoned the land was false. The tax records revealed continuous ownership and payments, further invalidating the HOA's justification for the sale. David then turned his attention to Victoria herself. His previous work in financial crime investigation had given him the tools to research her activities outside of the HOA. He began by looking into Victoria's personal financial records, including any properties she had recently acquired or sold. This investigation was methodical. David focused on discovering if there were any patterns that could indicate illegal activity, such as suspicious loans, asset transfers, or property sales. Through public records, David identified several properties that Victoria had recently acquired in the area. All of these transactions were connected to HOA decisions, and many seemed to be made under questionable circumstances. It appeared that Victoria was systematically purchasing properties from vulnerable residents, some of whom were elderly or in poor health. These residents, unable to fight back, had been pressured into selling their properties under the pretense that it was in the best interest of the neighborhood. Victoria's influence in the HOA allowed her to push these sales through without oversight or objection. The more David dug, the more he uncovered. In addition to the questionable property acquisitions, he found evidence that Victoria had used her position to secure a loan from a local bank. The loan, which she had obtained under false pretenses, had been used to purchase additional properties, including David's farm. David knew that banks required financial documentation to approve loans, so he focused on uncovering any forged or falsified financial statements Victoria may have submitted to the bank. His research revealed inconsistencies in the reported income on the loan application, indicating that she had lied to secure the funds. Victoria had not only manipulated the HOA, but also used fraudulent means to acquire substantial wealth. As David connected the dots between her property acquisitions, loan activities, and HOA involvement, he realized that her actions went far beyond the theft of his land. Victoria had been engaged in a pattern of illegal property transfers, using her position to exploit the community for personal gain. This was a much larger scheme than he had originally thought, and it was clear that Victoria's manipulation of the HOA was the linchpin in her operation. Further investigation revealed that Victoria had been funneling the profits from these transactions into offshore accounts. David discovered a trail of financial transfers that led to an account in the Cayman Islands. These transactions appeared to be part of a larger money laundering operation designed to hide the true extent of her wealth and the proceeds of her illegal activities. The use of offshore accounts, along with a fraudulent loan and property transfers, painted a picture of a highly organized and deliberate effort to exploit both the community and the financial system. With this new information, David knew he had found the key to dismantling Victoria's operations. The evidence he had gathered: illegal property transfers, forged documents, fraudulent loans, and offshore money laundering was enough to expose Victoria and the HOA as corrupt entities. However, David was aware that he needed more than just his findings to force action. He needed to ensure that this information was made public and that it would have legal consequences. David began compiling the evidence into a detailed report. He carefully organized the documents, ensuring that each piece of evidence was clearly explained and linked to the next. This report would serve as the backbone of his legal case, but it would also be used to bring the issue to public attention. He knew that exposing the truth was the only way to regain control of his farm and prevent further exploitation by Victoria and the HOA. By the time David had finished his investigation, he had amassed a comprehensive dossier that demonstrated the full extent of Victoria's corruption. The evidence was undeniable. Victoria's actions were not just unethical, they were criminal. With this in hand, David was ready to take his next steps, presenting the evidence to the public. The HOA and the authorities. Victoria's illegal activities were no longer a secret, and David had the tools to ensure that she could no longer use her power to exploit others. He now had the evidence needed to restore justice, reclaim his land, and hold Victoria accountable for her actions. The investigation had given him a clear path forward, one that would require perseverance, but more had already begun to dismantle the foundation of Victoria's corrupt empire. David's approach was methodical and strategic. After collecting all the evidence that demonstrated the wrongful sale of his farm and the illegal activities orchestrated by Victoria Sterling, he knew the next step was crucial. His goal was not only to recover his property, but also to ensure that Victoria's corruption was exposed. Both for his sake and for the benefit of the entire community, the evidence was comprehensive. David had documents proving the fraudulent sale of his farm, along with a series of forged signatures. He also had bank records showing suspicious transactions and connections between Victoria and the parties who had purchased the land. The investigation revealed an extensive pattern of property manipulation by Victoria, all facilitated by her position within the HOA. David also possessed documents linking her to several offshore bank accounts that had been used to launder money through these fraudulent transactions. David knew that simply relying on legal action would take time and could be slow-moving. So, he decided to confront the issue head-on at the next HOA meeting. This meeting was an opportunity to present his findings to the residents, to let them know the full extent of what had been happening right under their noses. When the meeting began, David stood at the back of the room, waiting for the appropriate moment. He observed the faces of the neighbors around him, many of whom were familiar. Some had heard rumors of Victoria's shady dealings, but none had concrete evidence. That's where David came in. He had the proof, and it was time to use it. As the meeting unfolded, David waited until Victoria had spoken, outlining her usual agenda with her typical air of confidence. She presented herself as the savior of the neighborhood, the one who kept things running smoothly and efficiently. But David was ready to challenge that image. When the time came, he stood up, briefcase in hand, and addressed the room. His voice was steady and clear as he began to speak. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Before we continue," David said, "I need to make a few things clear." He opened his briefcase, revealing a series of documents. One by one, he laid them out on the table, making sure every resident in the room could see them. The first set of papers he presented were the forged signatures on the sale agreement for his farm. He pointed to each one and explained how they had been falsified without his knowledge or consent. Next, he revealed the property transfer documents showing how Victoria had manipulated the HOA system to secure the sale. He traced the series of transactions, pointing out the involvement of a company that had close ties to Victoria. The room fell silent as David methodically laid out the evidence. The more documents he revealed, the more the residents began to realize the full scale of the manipulation that had been occurring behind the scenes. David then shifted focus, presenting bank records that revealed Victoria's connections to illegal financial activities. He demonstrated how she had used her position as HOA president to secure loans and acquire properties under false pretenses. The transactions were carefully documented, showing a clear pattern of financial mismanagement and fraud. At this point, David could see the change in the room. Victoria, once confident and composed, began to show signs of distress. She attempted to interject, to downplay the severity of the situation, but David wasn't finished. He continued, "This isn't just about my farm. It's about every family in this community that has been taken advantage of. Victoria has used her position to manipulate and deceive us all. I've gathered enough evidence to put her away for a long time. But I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to make sure that this never happens again." His words resonated with the residents. They began to realize the extent of Victoria's influence and how much damage her actions had caused. Many of them had been paying fees to the HOA for years without questioning how the funds were being used. Some had even been pressured into selling their properties or complying with unreasonable demands. They now understood that the woman they had trusted was not the leader they thought her to be. As David finished speaking, the room erupted into chaos. Some residents were angry, others shocked, but all of them were now aware of the truth. They had trusted Victoria, believing that she had their best interests at heart. Now they saw her for what she truly was, a manipulator who had been exploiting her position for personal gain. The atmosphere shifted. Victoria's grip on the HOA was crumbling. David knew that the fight wasn't over yet. Exposing the truth was only the first step. He had to make sure that the right actions were taken to restore justice. But as the meeting continued, it was clear that the momentum had shifted. The community had been given the tools to take action, and the support of the residents was now on his side. David's evidence had been presented, and the truth was out. There was no turning back for Victoria. The residents, once divided by Victoria's influence, were now united in their desire for justice. David had not only exposed her corruption, but he had also empowered the community to take a stand. The HOA's reign over the neighborhood was effectively over, and the residents would no longer be passive bystanders in the face of wrongdoing. The outcome of the meeting was uncertain, but David had achieved what he set out to do. He had confronted the truth head-on, and in doing so, had put an end to the control that Victoria had held over the neighborhood for so long. Following the HOA meeting, momentum shifted decisively in David's favor. The evidence presented against Victoria Sterling was too overwhelming to ignore. The fraudulent sale of David's land, the forged signatures, and the illegal financial transactions were all part of a much larger scheme that had been operating under the guise of community management. The authorities were quick to act on the information David had provided. Within days, an investigation was launched into Victoria's activities. Victoria's arrest was the first step in dismantling the corrupt system she had built. The investigation revealed that she had been involved in numerous illegal property acquisitions and had manipulated the HOA to line her pockets at the expense of the community. Her actions, which were once hidden behind her position of power, were now exposed for all to see. As the truth came to light, her influence evaporated, and her connections within the HOA and local government proved to be the foundation of her downfall. The legal proceedings that followed Victoria's arrest were swift. The charges against her included fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud property owners. Her once dominant position in the community quickly crumbled. The authorities seized her assets, including properties she had obtained under false pretenses. Victoria's wealth, amassed through deceit, was stripped away, and she found herself facing the consequences of her actions. The community watched as she lost everything, and the message was clear. No one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. For David, the resolution of this conflict meant more than just reclaiming his land. The fight to expose Victoria's wrongdoing had unified the neighborhood. Residents who had once been divided by the HOA's manipulation were now united in their desire for a fair and just community. The collective anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for years was now channeled into positive change. The HOA was restructured, and a new, transparent leadership was put in place. Community members were invited to participate in the decision-making process, ensuring that no one person could again hold unchecked power. David's farm was formally returned to him. The paperwork was corrected, and the land that had been unlawfully sold was restored to its rightful owner. The legal team worked quickly to ensure that David's ownership was recognized, and he was able to resume his work without the cloud of uncertainty that had hung over him for so long. His property, which had been taken under fraudulent circumstances, was now rightfully his again. However, the victory was not just David's. The entire neighborhood felt the impact of his fight. They had witnessed firsthand how one person's determination could bring about change. David had not only reclaimed his farm, but had also set a precedent for future battles against injustice within the community. The trust that had been eroded by years of corruption was slowly rebuilt. Neighbors who had once felt powerless now recognized their collective strength. David's victory was a testament to the power of standing up against wrongdoing. He didn't just win back the land that had been taken from him, he won back the respect of his community and the pride of knowing that he had fought for what was right. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace as he looked out over his land. The challenges he had faced had been daunting, but the resolution brought a sense of clarity and hope. The community, once fractured by corruption and manipulation, now operated on principles of transparency and fairness. David's actions had set a new standard for how the neighborhood would be governed moving forward. The residents were more involved, more aware of the importance of accountability, and more determined to ensure that no one would be able to exploit the system again. With Victoria gone and the HOA restructured, David knew that the land would remain his. He had fought for it, and he had won. But more importantly, he had fought for the integrity of his community. His victory was a reflection of the collective power of the residents who had come together to support what was right. David's future, once uncertain, was now clear. His farm was his, and it was no longer a symbol of loss, but of victory. The lessons learned from this battle would stay with him and with the community. They had all learned that standing up against injustice, no matter how insurmountable it seemed, could lead to meaningful change. The community had been restored, and with it, David's sense of purpose. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a symbol of resistance and renewal, a reminder of the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. David had no illusions. The fight had been hard, and there would always be challenges ahead. But he had learned one undeniable truth. No matter what came his way, he would never again allow anyone to take what was rightfully his. The land, the community, and the respect he had earned were his to protect, and he would do so without hesitation.